Hello, Furidashi listeners. Before we kick off Season 5, I wanted to say at the top of this episode that if you like what you hear and you kind of want to help us keep the lights on, head on over to patreon.com/Furidashi, where you can sign up for $5 a month to receive access to our full catalog of bonus episodes. This season, Lauren and I will probably be mostly talking about our trials and tribulations, so if that's something you're interested in, go become a patron. Though that said, if you want to stick to the free feed, we're more than happy to have you in whatever capacity you feel is best. In these trying times for the games industry, you just gotta do what's right for you. And so with that, on to this month's discussion of Delicious in Dungeon. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the return to Season 5 of the Furidashi Podcast. I am Nicholas, and I am here with Lauren. Lauren, say hello to... I don't know why I'm doing this voice. Say hello, Lauren.
I like the voice. Hello to the beautiful people of Season 5 of Furidashi Games and Media, a podcast where not only are we delving into the game design philosophies you know and love, but now getting to talk about something that really drew us together, which is our shared, undying love of anime.
Yay! Well, strangely enough, it's like this is kind of like the Nicholas and Lauren origin story, because we met in a class that I taught. I don't want to say how long ago, because it's going to make both of us sound very old.
No, exactly. You taught it like 2 years
It was
ago,
2 years ago. While we were doing the podcast, we met each other in a time warp.
Yeah, it was the Deep Space Tunnel.
Exactly.
Anyway,
So this go around. So in a previous season, we talked about, like, going through all of the steps of making a game, why it's hard, why it probably drove me a little crazy. And so as a reprieve from that, we have decided that this go around we're going to be alternating episodes, or one episode will be talking about a particular animated series or film, and then the interstitial episodes will be talking about games that are either explicitly related to those or that sort of share particular themes, or as in the case of the next episode, which will be on Dragon Age Veilguard, just a new game that's coming out that we're both very excited about. So with that in mind, this go around, we are going to be talking about the recent animated series Delicious in Dungeon, currently available on Netflix. In fact, I think it's being it was simul released on Netflix, as well as like when it was released in Japan. It is based on a manga by what is her name? I want to say Ryoko. Don't quote me on that. Anyway, a manga artist who created this particular series. I think it was a couple years ago.
Yoko Kui.
Yeah, and so she is a relative newcomer to the manga scene. She had done a little bit of work before that. But what was really interesting about in Japanese, donjon mish, so like dungeon meals or dungeon food, I believe is how they translate it in the anime, is that it sort of takes the idea of the dungeon crawl, like the idea that like literally you're going into a dungeon to like find something, as in this case to find your probably dead sister, maybe maybe not dead sister, and all of the sort of the travails and trials that occur as a result. But the particular unique spin that this show puts on it is to, like, just to give a brief overview. um, so at the very beginning of the series, Laios and his party, they're fighting a red dragon, and they're doing very badly. And so Laios' sister, Fallen, She sort of last ditch Hail Mary, like teleports everyone except for herself out. And then Laios immediately wants to go back into the dungeon, but then he realizes like they don't actually have the supplies or the stuff that they'll need to get back to where they were. And so Laios comes up with this bizarre plan to, instead of paying for provisions, to just eat the monsters that they kill in the dungeon. And so that's the sort of overarching structure of the show. It's like, this week we're going to kill this monster and here is how you prepare it.
Yeah, and I think like something to point out though in the narrative is that he kind of like finds this dungeon monster eating manual. Like it's a monster
Yeah,
manual, but it's like to cook monster, you
yeah.
know? Yeah.
And it's
And
not
so I
very
think
good. It's a bad manual. It doesn't work very well.
it is a very bad manual. Yeah, you know? And so everything has to be home rules anyway. And so
Yeah.
yeah. So I think it's interesting to kind of start with I think Delicious in Dungeon and kind of talk about the I know we wanted to talk break down that narrative structure, right? Of like it's a recipe of the week, it's kind
Yeah,
of
yeah.
like a monster of the week. But like before we kind of get into that, what's some of like the you found a lot of really cool, interesting history tidbits that you found
Oh
in like
yeah.
the show because the show came out in well like it was actually first serialized in 2014, which I thought was
Yeah.
pretty interesting.
The manga was
Yeah,
first
the
serialized.
manga,
Yeah.
right? But then the show wasn't started until 2023.
Yeah.
So it's a very recent, we would say, like anime. And we're doing anime specifically because it is something that you consume kind of visually
Yeah.
versus, right, like books you have to read. Like it's a very different medium.
Well,
So
there's
yeah, what was some of the?
still visual. I mean,
It's
it's still
still
a comic.
visual.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's still a comic, but there's just different there's that translation, right, from like document to screen that
Yeah,
I
and yeah,
think,
and there
yeah,
are some important distinctions, like, a really important component of the animated series is the really excellent voice acting by the Japanese cast. I'm going to insist that by the Japanese cast. I won't explain that. And then also just the sort of the general sound design, all the things that like animation does that really a comic can't do. So what Lauren is referring to is the fact that, Lauren, you said you read an interview with Kui in which she said that she actually didn't really know that much about like RPGs or like tabletop RPGs in general. Is that right?
I did, yeah.
So,
Um,
and that actually kind of surprised me, but then I realized that actually it doesn't really matter if she knew anything about, say, like Dungeons and Dragons or any of the like, insert RPG, like sword and sorcery RPG of your choice, because there was a really seminal animated series from the 90s called Record of Lodoss War, which was big in Japan, big in Japan, but not really that well known outside of Japan. I mean, I think you can watch it on Crunchyroll if I remember correctly, but it didn't really have the sort of the cachet in the West that, say, like your Dragon Ball Z had or like Gundam has, or anything like that. And the reason why Lotus War is important is, like, one, okay, so there are some pretty clear parallels. The parties are very similar in the two series. So the party is headed up in Lotus War by a sword guy named Parn. We have a sword guy named Laios in Delicious in Dungeon. You have a magic user named Deedlit, just like you have a magic user, sorry, an elven magic user named Deedlit in Lodos, and then you have an elven magic user in Delicious in Dungeon as well, named Marcel. You have a rogue slash thief character in both. In fact, this is probably one of the closest parallels. Who in Lotus War is called Woodchuck. That's his nickname, and then the character in Delicious in Dungeon is Chillchuck. So they both take place on these isolated islands full of like all sorts of dangerous creatures. Um, so I mean, to be honest, like just watch a little bit of Lodos and then go back and watch Delicious in Dungeon, and you'll be like, okay, I see the parallels. But the reason why this is important is because Lodos originated as a series of recaps of D&D sessions. And so the reason why I say it doesn't really matter if Kui was that familiar with like RPGs and sort of their ins and outs, in many ways the sort of like the seminal media text that she is clearly relying on itself is very clearly tied to that history of how tabletop RPGs were developed and sort of like evolved over time in Japan. So the way Lodos went is that you have these recaps. The recaps then later became a series of fantasy novels, and those fantasy novels are in many ways kind of like the ur text for high fantasy sword and sorcery, like in Japan. Obviously not in the West, because in the West it goes back much further. But the reason why I wanted to bring all this up is because there's a way in which like these ideas of a sort of like gamified structure for narrative kind of gets diffused into a media landscape in many ways without people even knowing it. And that's really kind of all the only point that I wanted to make, is that even if Kui herself isn't like literally opening up the player's handbook and going, oh yeah, okay, this is how D&D works, or this is how, like, what's another one, Rollmaster works. I don't know why I chose Rollmaster, Call of Cthulhu, whatever. Even if
No, I
she's
mean,
even if
no,
she's
keep
not
going.
specifically doing that, it actually doesn't matter, because these ideas of like how narrative gets structured in relationship to role playing games are kind of just like endemic to a lot of media.
They are, and I think what's really fascinating is the reason is that the more I've watched movies, especially after being in games and being a dungeon master, right? And I say dungeon master because that is the Dungeons and Dragons kind of official term. I do actually believe they've kind of trademarked slash registered it, because if you
Yeah,
use other games, that's the role master, the game master, and in Vampire the Masquerade, it's the storyteller, which I also really love
yeah,
as a verbiage. For me, what's really important about Nicholas's kind of like art, I wouldn't say argument, but kind of thesis proposal here, right? Is that this type of narrative structure from these kind of social tabletop gaming really kind of was endemic to even some of the novels that came out of like early point and click adventure games. Like
yeah,
Myst had a whole trilogy.
yeah,
And in every single one of those, it really does feel like you're kind of playing the game, in that everything's like a mystery and you have to interact and go out of your way constantly. And what I found is that in watching current film and current media, I and all gamers, whether you're like all game developers and slash gamers, right? Game consumers, I think we all kind of watch like any sort of film now. And we're like, oh man, he's going up to the roof. I bet the ladder's going to break. Oh, there it goes, right? Like,
yeah,
oh, he's running down the stairs. He's going to have to slide because the catwalk's going to give out. Like,
yeah,
there's all of these classic scenes that felt really good to play from things like, Uncharted, Tomb Raider, now Star Wars Outlaw, in the same vein. And you see these now, I think, in popular culture and popular media. But with this particular example, what I'm super fascinated by is because, I was actually not familiar with the record of Lodoss War, um, was that um, when she gave the interview, Kui actually admits, in one of the interview questions, that it's obvious you enjoy TTRPGs. Can you tell us about one of your favorite player characters you've ever created? And she just like straight face says, actually, I've never played Dungeons and Dragons, and I didn't learn the word TTRPG until I became an adult. But I've seen a lot of popular media about Dungeons and Dragons, and so I bought the player's guide and some of the novels. So I have knowledge, but I've actually never really played a TTRPG myself.
yeah,
We're going to link to this interview as well by Anime News Network, which actually did bring up a little bit of controversy. And this just came out in 2020, in August of 2024. And so, for context, we are recording this in October of 2024.
yeah,
And so, I think what's really fascinating too is that as an author, as a creator, like you can write something really engaging, even if you are not. She's a very picky eater, does not like cooking, and also apparently didn't play Dungeons and Dragons. And so I'm super fascinated by the kind of structural comparison, right, that we can make between Record of Lodoss War, right, and things
yeah,
that as a mangaka she would be familiar with,
yeah,
right, in her repertoire, that is in her toolkit, that then she goes, hey, you know what's really inventive? This thing called D&D that I see people liking. And what I realized is it looks a lot like this manga that I've read. right? Now,
Yeah.
whether or not she's familiar with the history or not, like we're not supposing or projecting what is actually happening
Yeah.
in her brain. But I think it's really fascinating for us to kind of talk about because I was just reading this interview going like, this is wildly crazy, right? Versus, you're going, hey, no, I actually am super entrenched in anime and manga and I can directly see this inspiration.
Well, I don't think it would have to just be Lotus. Like, I think there are very clear parallels, but also just like if you have ever played a Final Fantasy game, like you've experienced this structure. And in many ways, it is the underlying structure of what we typically refer to as like the core gameplay loop. This idea that you go in, you do a thing, and then as a result of doing a thing, you get something, and then with that something, you then prepare to do the next thing. And what is that? That is the structure of a recipe, and that is the structure of a recipe specifically if you're like trying to kill monsters in order to provide the ingredients. So like in many ways, all she's really done is she's taking a very like tried and true structure, like narrative structure that is used constantly in games. Like you go out, you do a thing, you kill something, you loot it, and then whatever loot you get from it, you then use that loot for something else. If you get gold, you use it to buy gear or to stay at an inn, or maybe you collect bear butts so that way you can make the bear butt armor. I'm sorry, I always use bear butts as an
You
example.
always kill bears, but only their butts.
I
I
only take their
think like
butts.
I like the idea of you knocking at a bear, shaving its butt, but like it's still alive, and there's just this pantsless bear walking
That's true.
around.
Like, okay, it doesn't have to be a combat encounter. You could actually go out and say, "Hey, like there was this wacko in the village who wanted me to kill you to take your butt." But I was actually just thinking that maybe like I could get you some really nice meat and then I could just shave your butt and then we don't have to kill you and then I could take it back to the wacko and he'll think that I killed you when I didn't actually do
In this instance, you're
it.
the wacko, and it's because you like want a wig or something. You know what I mean?
Maybe, yeah,
Like my
yeah.
head gets cold, and I need a hat for
But
the
like,
winter.
I think the wacko-ness is actually kind of important because like in Delicious in Dungeon, this is played off sometimes for comedy and sometimes in a kind of more serious way. And in each instance, though, like they're killing or in some cases just harvesting a
Yeah.
particular like monster to then make a meal to then like do the things. So instead of like buying gear or going back to the wacko in the village, they're using that stuff that they loot in a sense in order to create these meals so that they can keep going in the dungeon. Like that's
Yep.
literally just the gameplay loop.
Yeah, and I think okay, so what I think is really awesome about the gameplay loop as well is before we kind of dive into that gameplay loop as a narrative structure, as you can see within Delicious and Dungeon, I'm gonna pull us a little bit back into history because for my kind of like research into this is I looked at kind of one of the main inspiration points for the author
Yeah.
that's from her interview, right? And she really loved Panzer Dragoon. That
Yeah,
was her
okay.
main
Makes
inspiration for
sense, yeah.
this, which makes perfect sense because within this plot, just to super TLDR it, is that dragons used to be a huge myth. And instead, they find out they're not when Alita, the lady, is stolen by a black dragon. And now, in order to defeat the black dragon, Kyle, the main
Yeah.
character, must form an alliance with another dragon to rescue her before she becomes basically like a dark creature to destroy the world, right?
Yeah, and the red
And
drag and the red dragon is a huge component in Delicious in
and
Dungeon, yeah.
yeah, the red dragon is a huge component in Delicious and Dungeon. And so it's obviously got that huge tie in, right? And it's overworld story. And so I think that like kind of one of the things we should target when we look at like the narrative structure, right, is there's obviously, right, this kind of like there's a large theme, right, of what like the Delicious and Dungeon is. And I think its theme really is um it is like that D&D-esque theme, which is about kind of like underdogs coming together in unconventional ways, right?
Yeah,
Like that's kind of the pillar of any good, I think, and or bad question mark D&D campaign where you have four friends or three friends or a stranger and they don't really want to be friends, but over time, right, they develop a bond and they come together and they overcome a lot of different challenges and adversity and they'll probably save the world. At least that's the hope, right? Like that's the
yeah.
campaign structure. So there is this like longer thread. But then when we look at the actual narrative loops or like the episodic structure,
Yeah.
right, of the anime, the episodic structure itself then has different themes for every character, and every
Yeah.
character has their different arcs inside of that. And so if we break it down from, say, like that theme, and then we look at that tone of kind of like it's super wacky, like you are eating kelpie hair because
Yeah.
it's a kelpie and kelp, and then kelp is seaweed, and then
Yeah.
yay, right? Like it's hilarious. Like I just the connections make perfect sense,
Yeah.
and yet I never in my life would have gone, yes, this, you know what I mean? Like, yes, this is,
Yeah.
of course, this is like Trashu. Like, of
Yeah.
course, this is, just like a pig, or,
Well, yeah, and it's also worth noting that like within the character's experience, so like Laios wants to do this primarily because it's made to seem, especially in the first episode, as if like he's kind of always wanted to eat monsters, and now this is just a convenient excuse to actually do it. And everyone else in the party, at least at that point, which is really only two other people, it's just Chilchuk and Marcel, because they haven't met Senshi yet. They're kind of, I mean, Marcel is definitely grossed out by this, continues to be grossed out by it. And Chilchuk is kind of like, oh, I'll deal with it, I guess. And as a result, then, like, it's always a kind of, how should I put this? There's a way in which the food becomes a kind of, oh God, I can't believe I'm going to say this, almost like a diagrammatic narrative. What do I mean by that? Without talking about a paper I wrote a really long time ago. So what this means is that sort of like you're watching something and it has a narrative structure that's relevant for the characters, and like it has meaning for their lives and their experiences, but also at the same time it also kind of takes on the tenor or the tone of a kind of instructive framework. And you see this in games as well. Like, this is what a tutorial is oftentimes. A tutorial has like a narrative, it has like a bit of the story that it's trying to tell, while at the same time, it's also trying to instruct you how to play the game. And I don't necessarily think that, you know, Delicious in Dungeon is actually trying to be like, oh, this is how you like kill a basilisk, and this is how you prepare the various parts, and this is how you prepare
yeah. So
swords.
I
But it
think
has,
in no, I was gonna say like this, it has elements of it, and to kind of just like briefly maybe like summarize what you're trying to say is that let's just break apart the words diagrammatic, which
diagrammatic.
basically
So
mean diagrammatic. So it's
yeah,
a diagram, and when you
yeah,
think of diagramming something, right, you think of like a Venn diagram, everyone, right? And it's to show relationships between two opposing things and their similarities, right? So you've got two circles like Lauren and Nicholas, and then where we align, which is pretty much everything. So it's really just like one big circle with some little outliers. I'm kidding. We do have individual personalities. I
yeah.
promise we are not a hive mind
We are not a
yet.
circle. No, we are not a
We are
circle.
not a circle. But in the middle, right, is then us giving this episode. That's a diagram. And like in your head, you're like, oh, I can visualize, Lauren, two circles, right? And then there's overlapping. Diagrammatic writing means, can you do this with like words, scare quotes with words here, but can you do this in a story, right? And so I actually reference this in like whenever you watch a cooking video,
Yeah,
right? I say what a cooking video is not a diagram because it's step by steps and instructional, right? Versus, so for example, like you need 200 grams of flour, 200 grams of water, knead until prepared, add some yeast. This is not a great way to make bread. Don't do this. Somehow it rises, and then do some stuff and it gets into a bread. Diagrammatic, like a recognition of that would be more like less explanatory and step by step, and would be more like, oh, you need to make some bread. And so then you would go over and you'd see some flour, you'd see some water, you'd put them together in the game, and then it's just like, you know, add the yeast to make it rise. But it's like it's a little bit more trickier than that. Like there is a lot more nuance to it. But I think that like the point is that like you're not watching this show to learn how to cook pork
but it has,
belly.
yeah,
Yeah.
but it has the vibe of
But it
that.
has the vibe of, yeah, and that's where all of my head went to when I was looking at Delicious in Dungeon as an anime, because I do watch a bunch of anime, specifically like slice of life slash like here's how to cook a thing, but it
Yeah,
doesn't, or it's always about a food item or a drink. So I watch a lot of stuff like that, but it's not instructional. I can't, after watching an episode, I'm not like, I know how to make the best udon in the world. Like, that does not happen.
Yeah, no, no. But the thing is like it's more that it's a particular mode of address. Because like even when you see like those vignettes within the individual episodes, like the way it's because it's usually Senshi describing how to prepare something. Like he's literally talking to you as a you. Like there is both the stand-in you, which is Laios, like because he's talking to Laios. Like Laios, you have to do X, Y, and Z to prepare this. But the way in which it's rhetorically structured in the show, it can then also be interpreted as if it's talking to you, the audience, in the same way.
Yeah.
And the reason why I think this is really important for the show as a whole is because that mode of address and that way of thinking about like what the characters are doing and why doesn't just apply to the food, it also applies to the magic in the show. Because like there are several episodes where Marcial is called upon to do a kind of like ritualistic, more ritualistic sort of like magical thing rather than just like blasting a monster with her fireballs or whatever they are. And in those instances, like, and I don't want to spoil this, but there is one in particular where like because of the particular components that she needs for this like dark ritual that she's about to do, it actually uses a lot of things that then are also used in like the preceding and following episodes to make food. Like she is doing like a food magic in a kind of way because of the need to use this like flesh in order to do this. And so as a
Mm-hmm.
result, like the fact that it's recipes, it's not just a cute gimmick. It's not just like, oh, isn't it kind of goofy how these guys are going to go and do a dungeon crawl and then they're going to make hot pot? No, it's not. I mean, because that's the funny
Yeah,
side, the
no,
wacky side.
yeah, it's you can be Siri. You can be Siri. You can be silly and you can be serious at the same time. And I think that's really what you're trying to get at is that it would be very wacky and tongue in cheek and kind of goofy if it really was just about only eating the monsters. And sure, there was this like plot to save Fallon from the Red Dragon, right?
Yeah,
But ultimately, the I'm used to saying the word player. Wow. And so my brain just stopped at viewer.
yeah,
But like the viewer isn't going to really necessarily get that. But because I think it uses this kind of tool of addressing the like viewer through the characters almost,
yeah,
that in some ways I think you could learn to make some of those dishes with the things they are supposed to represent, but like in a very stepped back sort of way, almost as if your mom is trying to teach you how to cook, which you can see in the like interview article where she was like, I remember my mom always telling me to do this when you make okonomiyaki, and now I always do that. But she didn't go out of her way to kind of like create a recipe. It's like someone's telling you how to do something. It's very verbal, right? And I
yeah,
think that just ties back into that structure of kind of the dungeon master and the D&D tabletop aspect, because in D&D you aren't being told by a game and you're not reading a book and you're not kind of like reading or trying to like a walkthrough or a guide. Like you have the dungeon master telling you, you walk into a room,
yeah,
right? And you see a puddle of water on the floor, four columns. It's dark and dank and misty, and a small light is illuminates a basin at the far end of the wall, right?
yeah.
And suddenly you're like, oh, I have a picture, and then the rogue's like, I jump over the puddle. And it's like, why do you jump over the puddle? And then but I'm like, okay, I guess you just jump over the puddle for literally no reason
Well,
whatsoever.
because it's the paranoia that all players feel when the dungeon master mentions something very specific that would
Yeah,
otherwise be very ordinary.
but exactly. And
Yeah,
I think that I use that as the example because in Dungeon Meshi, we have so many of those, like, oh, what are these vines doing here? No, don't touch the vines,
yeah,
right? Or like, oh, look at all of these gold coins on the ground. No, they're not like, it's that subversion. And I think
yeah,
that kind of lends itself really well to the what you're describing here, which is addressing the audience via a character, right? And the media that's already there.
Yeah, and what so one even though you wouldn't necessarily be able to make these specific dishes, obviously, because it uses a bunch of fantasy ingredients, like I think the one takeaway lesson that you especially get from Senshi is that it's really it matters a lot how you prepare things, how you approach them, and how you handle them. Because this is a theme that comes up again and again and again. Like in one episode when they're harvesting mandrakes, like Senshi says, well, mandrakes are dangerous to harvest because their scream can kill you when you pull them out. And Marcial says that, like, the way we always harvested mandrakes, in magic school was to, what did she say? She's like, they tie them to, I think it's a dog. And then like the dog pulls it out and the dog dies as a result of hearing the scream. And then they go pick up the mandrake later. And Senshi's like, no, you don't have to do it like that. You can just like pull it out a little, cut the head off, and then it's fine. But then what later comes up is that, and so like Marcial's made to feel kind of stupid for, coming up with this elaborate like way of doing things, which, also kills a dog. And then later she actually does it with a bat. But the thing is that even though she's made to feel stupid in that particular moment, one of the things that Senshi realizes is that like by pulling out the mandrakes her way, that the flavor and the texture is actually much better than his way. And so like the clear, I guess, point that's being made there is that it really does matter like how particular you are about doing these things. Like that is something that comes up over and over again. It's like, no, you can't prepare the scorpion tail like that. You have to do it like this. And the reason why it's relevant for like the overarching narrative is that when it comes to the point that Marcel is going to do that ritual that I alluded to earlier, sh- because of the way in which she does it, it causes a very nasty problem for everyone involved. And so then that theme of like you need to be very particular about how you prepare these recipes, and sort of the way in which like the recipes and like the magic rituals like have are analogies for each other. So then it means that the same thing, like the point about you need to be particular about these ingredients, you also need to be particular about the magic, because if you're not, then these subtle, in this case, very dangerous things will happen.
Yeah,
And the way that sort of very neatly ties everything together and draws upon that sort of like I said, the idea of like the gameplay loop. God, it's like I don't want to say this too many times this episode, but it's a really fucking great show. Like, and also the manga is like this as well. It's extremely tight. Like for as goofy and silly and as like wackadoo as it may seem at times, it is actually really, really tightly constructed. Okay, full stop. Mic drop.
yeah, mic drop. No, I have nothing to add to that. I will say that for me, like, what's really just before we kind of get into that kind of story structure again, is just remember that we have talked about like that there's that theme kind of overarching of like, right, desperate heroes coming together. And
Yeah,
I think that's the surface, right? But what Nicholas is pointing out is that when you are using this type of writing style to address the viewer, that is the character that is being addressed, but the viewer is like kind of self-inserting themselves and, oh, you're teaching me how to make a martini or a gen fez, or such as in the anime bartender, which is very, very good. Or you're telling me, right, how to make an okonomiyaki out of all these monster parts. Or there's a particular episode about ghost sorbet or something where they're basically eating ghosts,
yeah,
which is just then even stranger, but it's because ghosts are cold, so obviously it would make ice cream. And I think that like there's that type of style of writing really will obviously emphasize, right, this theme of particularity, this theme
yeah,
of like preparedness, this theme of really be careful, right, what ingredients you use. And I think it's that theme of carefulness, right, and the writing style that we're talking about that then ultimately, right, is what's lending itself very neatly and also tying everything in really tightly with that story structure that does, right, mirror that social tabletop gaming experience.
yeah. Because the thing is like one of the, I mean, just to like put a little bit of a bow on it. I mean, the whole idea of like having, a monster of the week, but then sort of like this overarching narrative that kind of connects it all together. Like in many ways, you can think about your own tabletop sessions in a very similar way. Because, you show up at a friend's house, you're probably going to be there for a couple of hours, and you're not going to do, you may have like one or two combat encounters in the context of that session, or, maybe even not combat encounters, maybe just like, diplomatic stuff, or, maybe shopping because, you gotta get your gear. But when you put all of those together, all of those like self-contained sessions, just like these self-contained episodes, then they become sort of like the various links in the chain that then become like the larger narrative arc. And this is a similar thing that at least good GMs do when they're thinking about like how they're going to prepare for a particular session, because it's not just like, I'm going to throw this particular monster at you this time. It's like, how is this then going to fit into like the future plans that I have for like whoever like the big bad guy happens to be, or for like whatever like large political situation my players are dealing with. Like that idea of sort of like the session being like the episode, and then sort of like the serial narrative being like the overarching narrative that your GM prepares for you, like that too is very much in the DNA of this show. So even even like I said, it doesn't matter that Kui doesn't necessarily have that sort of like direct personal experience with that, because you can get it in all sorts of different ways. And yet at the same time, like she still somehow managed to figure out how that works and do it in such a way that it's not just repeating somebody's D&D session. I think it's actually really important that it has, I mean, I don't want to call it a gimmick. It is a bit of a gimmick, but it has this weird hook
Well,
in
I
ter-
think in media terms, I think you, well, not media, but like in media studies or in comparative literature analysis, right? You would call it a gimmick, right?
yeah.
Or like a gag. Now, I think in like Western media, we tend to use gimmicks slash gags in kind of a, rudimentary, like, ha ha sort of way. It's my like nasally interpretation of the 90s, I guess. Um, and I think that like that's just not the correct use of what we mean by when we say like gimmick or hook or kind of like pull or gag, right? We just basically mean like a repeating, kind of
Just a
like theme or use case,
just a
right?
motif, like, yeah, a
It's just a
recurring motif.
motif,
Yeah.
right? A recurring motif. That's a better word. But then when people think
Yeah.
of motifs, I don't think they'll think of like
A thing that keeps happening over and over again. We're just going to
a
call
thing that keeps having over and over again.
it that.
A bit.
A bit. A
There we
bit.
go.
It is a bit. It
It's
is
a
a
bit,
bit.
like in a comedy bit. Yeah. See, even comedians can't use the word gag anymore. Um, and the more I say that word, the more it loses all meaning. So, but a bit, right? It uses the recipes and the monster eating as a bit, but like it's that metaphor, right? That I think ties in everything together. That it's like when you're cooking, you got to be really careful because if you're going to burn it, it's not going to taste good. Like cooking actually takes a lot of work.
Yeah.
Oh, you know what else takes a lot of work? Well, just monster slaying in general, slash the entire, right? This is the larger narrative, but now it's the ecosystem of the dungeon. And I think
Yeah.
the ecosystem is really, really important because I wanted to compare Delicious in Dungeon to the anime that I kind of referenced a little bit earlier here, which is Bartender.
Yeah.
Um, and that anime is available on Crunchyroll right now. And my small segue here is that Netflix and Crunchyroll do not sponsor this episode. We are continued unsponsored. However, if anybody at Netflix or Crunchyroll would love to sponsor us, please, we would love free subscriptions and some sponsorship here to analyze and review your shows for their gameplay and narrative
I love
structures.
I love how like
Uh,
every episode we devolve into like some new, like, I don't know, sponsor that we're trying to court. Like I think one
I
time
think it's better than mattresses, right? It's better than like
it
we
is better
need
than
sleep as
mattresses.
developers,
That's
so
right. 'Cause
could we?
it's just that in the past we've done like Dr. Pepper. By the way, Dr. Pepper, if you're listening, we would still like that.
We will still take you. Okay, that's my side tangent or my little plug for anybody out there listening. All right, but I want to compare this to the Crunchyroll anime Bartender because in that anime, it got incredibly emotionally powerful for me. Just in every single, as it built. At first, I was like, this is going to be really cute, totally shallow, nice, relaxing slice of life anime slash also like the very not emotionally dense at all live action show. Midnight Diner, which is also on Netflix or was at one point.
I think
That
it still
sarcasm,
is.
by the way, is incredibly emotionally deep.
Yeah.
Um, and both of these shows, Bartender and Midnight Diner, both kind of feature, right, a dish every episode, and in Bartender they feature a drink. And there's this huge metaphor is that the drink represents a very specific moment in that one person's life.
Yeah.
And if he gets the drink wrong, it's because he's not capturing that feeling of that person's memory or what that person needs to, right, relieve, like relieve their stress for the day. And I
Yeah.
think that's kind of the reason why I'm bringing that up is that it's a much shorter anime, say, than Delicious in Dungeon. And if you're for some reason not a fan of amazing shows like and or Dungeons and Dragons, I guess, or you just are tired of fantasy shows, or you've seen all of Delicious in Dungeon and want something different to watch, watch Bartender. Because I'm not taught how to make the drinks, but I am taught what goes into them, and they are addressing right another character in that show with, well, here's why a gin fizz is so hard to make. This is why it's really incredible that he did it, or this is how he got it wrong, right? And
Yeah.
you're looking at all of the different bartender struggles, and this is what the Gen Fizz represents to, say, this patron that is here. And in the same way, I see a lot of the dishes that Senshi makes and that they find in the manual, right? It's like the manual is the gimmick because the recipe book isn't always right,
Yeah.
which is kind of another theme you see in the show a lot, which is great for any cooks out there that swear by recipes, and great for cooks like me who don't recipes. And maybe I'm in the middle, but I think that what's really important about this is like seeing this kind of similar structure in different animes, right? Kind of shows us that like Bartender does not have what Nicholas is describing as that gameplay loop of go out, collect, come back, and is definitely not inspired by gaming, but does have the anime trope of slice of life, teach you about something that's really important, and have a meal that becomes a metaphor. And so I think that Ryoko Kui, the mangaka Kui, who uses this, is using meals as metaphors, using those enemy types as metaphors as well. And so she's not just drawing from, I think, the game. I think she's also kind of superimposing this kind of known, like recipe and kind of trope that's existed in other animes as well. And I think that's also what makes it tight, is that it's familiar to even viewers who maybe don't understand TTRPG. They do understand, right? Like these kind of cooking animes, you could say.
Yeah, no, and I think that actually brings up a subject that isn't in our show notes, but I think we should talk about, which is characterization. Something that is really fundamental to, I mean, because the point that you were making about sort of like the drink representing like the bartender's understanding of a particular individual, that's not really necessarily the function of the individual meals, but the sort of the process of like dealing with these monsters and preparing these meals then provides, I guess you could say, sets the stage for these characters to sort of one reveal the nature of their relationship to each other, reveal their strengths, reveal their weaknesses. So the sort of like the openings that the recipes and all that like goes into like acquiring this stuff leaves is one that can be filled by like the characters explaining, not necessarily always explaining, but sometimes showing why they are the way they are. Like for example with the mandrakes, um like Marcia is really kind of upset that she's been made to seem like a doofus for like, oh, there's a much easier way to do this, and so she goes out and sort of like recklessly goes after and tries to use her method to get these mandrakes anyway, and ends up causing, hilarity ensues. And I think this is important for Marcela as a character, that she doesn't like feeling incompetent, precisely because then when things do get more serious and she's put in a situation where like she needs to use her specific skills in order to save someone, it both is successful and it's not. Like again, her recklessness puts everyone else in a difficult spot. And so like again, in the silly moment, it sets up the opportunity to reveal something is kind of in a kind of safe space about Marcille that's like, oh she's so reckless, like she just can't get over herself. But then that's important because it will then be used later. And again, this is why I say everything is so tight in the series, is because it really understands how to introduce certain aspects of like these various characters in a funny, or I guess you could say sometimes harmless way, that is then going to be reused and sort of like it's like theme and variation. Like the theme is set, like this character
Yep.
is reckless, this character is a little weird, this character has a strange fetish for eating monsters. But then as it progresses, the variations then flesh that out, and in fleshing that out, they also flesh out the character.
Yeah, and then I think this just kind of ties back to the overall kind of like premise of the aesthetic of Delicious in Dungeon, which I love that name because it is D&D, is the acronym for Delicious
Oh,
in Dungeon.
okay, I only just got that.
Yeah.
Oh my god, you're right. Because I've thought of this so long. I'm like, how did they get delicious in dungeon out of dungeon? Because like dungeon meshi just means like dungeon food or dungeon meals. Like, how did they get delicious in dungeon? But you're right. That's why.
Yeah,
Oh my
that's
god.
why. I was gonna make a point, but I think that is the point I should make. No, I will make my original point, but I love seeing you go through that on air. To me it was obvious. Like,
Yeah.
'cause I was like, oh, Delicious in Dungeon, that's clever. I kickstarted a homebrew campaign once, and that's exactly what it was. It was homebrew, how to turn your I bought this in like 2015, I think, or 2017. It is a D&D manual that is a homebrew, and the entire class and system is just like you have a baker and a chef and like the herbalist, and it's just about cooking meals, but in the using the rule say it of D&D 3.5 edition. Everybody, this is before D&D
Oh
5.
wow. Yeah.
And so and it didn't use D&D 4 because it was like screw that. Uh, and I don't know. I bought it at some point, sometime around the you could use this for Pathfinder if you wanted to era. And I just think that it was very fascinating. So that's my tangent. Excuse us, everyone. My point is that this kind of actually really then ties back into the narrative structure of a Dungeons and Dragons session, of a TTRPG session,
Yeah.
where what is a game of D&D about at the end of the day? It's about you and your friends telling a story together,
Yeah.
but you all have different motives. You all have different player characters. And you're all my best friends, and so I kind of have to make every single one of you happy, and all of your characters need to grow in the way you want them to grow. And then I also need to remember, right, that you really don't like being incompetent. Okay, I'm going to file that because I'm going to say you suddenly learn how to do this ritual, but I'm going to make you roll for it. So there's some chance, right? Maybe
Yeah.
you succeed, maybe you don't. If you succeed, you realize you can be competent in these scenarios, you get confidence. But since it's random, the next time or the next session or episode you come at, you could roll really poorly because the dice hate you that day. You try the same exact ritual, but now it fails. And suddenly your character, the only thing you can do is say, well, why? And I think this is what ties really, really nicely into how she was able to internalize, right, the player's guidebook from Dungeons and Dragons, assumedly 3.5 or 4th edition back in 2014.
2014 would have still been fourth, although
It was
5 would
4th,
have been
but
about to come out.
5 was about to come out.
Yeah.
Yeah, 5 was about to come out, but it was 4th. But the issue is that it was 4th and people still played 3.5 because
Yeah,
of
I don't
the.
really know what was commonly used in Japan at the time.
I don't know what was commonly used in Japan at the time. But we don't know. Okay, but let's
Yeah.
just say D&D in general, like the consensus of you have 4 characters or 3 characters around the table, and you are the DM, right?
Yeah.
And I think that like that type of aesthetic, that type of narrative structure is just so under like underappreciated, I would say, sometimes in traditional media because we have ingrained it into our, I think, culture, like you were saying when we started this episode, that we already have that kind of endowed within us. But I think that what really sells this for me is that it doesn't just have like a monster of the week. It doesn't just have the gameplay loop within D&D's combat structure, right? Or its systemic structure. It has the social structure,
Yeah.
right? Of a dungeon master making sure every single one of their characters gets their kind of moment to shine, and their character arcs, and then just kind of files that for labor. So it's a really good like serialization and kind of repetitive narrative that you would only see, I think, in D&D.
Yeah, I think that's
Um,
actually a really good point to end on. This idea that each character in the show is given room to breathe and given room to sort of express who they are in in many ways. In other words, it's not just like, oh, here's the episode that's about this character, or here's the episode that's now about this character, and we give you their entire backstory. Like in each episode, each character is allowed to contribute their particular piece to, the bit as a whole. And that is very much like the social environment of the gaming session itself. And so, I mean, until Lauren pointed this out, I didn't even realize this, but yeah, like it's not just that, Chilchuck is the one who does all of like the trap stuff and, guiding them through the dungeon. It's not just that Senshi is the one who apparently knows how to make everything, which is sort of big question mark why he knows how to do all that. Or the fact that, like, Marcel is the magic user, because in many ways it's a very stereotyped party structure. It's like, you've got the rogue, you've got the fighter, you've got the magic user,
Yep.
and you've got the dwarf.
The dwarf that somehow knows everything. That's what I'm trying to say. It's the jack of all trades dwarf, which you'd think would be a bard, but no. They're the min-maxer who not only knows everything, but absolutely just took it for like barbarian strength and con.
Yeah.
And so they ultimately end up becoming the tank. And then they're like, how did you get this adamantium pot? And they're just like, well, the DM said I could roll, and I rolled, and then I just wrote it down, and then I didn't tell anybody. And the DM's just known the whole time, though. But no one else cared because they're like, you min-maxer at the table.
Yeah.
You don't role play. You're not just going to do whatever.
And none of these characters are min-maxers at all.
Like, yeah, except for kind of Senshi. Kinda. Yeah. But only at the beginning, really, and then he comes in clutch at times, and then suddenly you realize like he didn't really min-max. But you know what I mean? Like
but again, because he's set up as the guy who knows everything. But then over time, you start to realize like his own insecurities and his own faults.
Yep. Yeah, so it's really, really good. It's a really big, like, I can see, if I was at a table, like I can see myself playing with those people, like playing with those characters.